introduce Marcus Westbury, the founder of Renew Newcastle and Renew Australia. Marcus's background is a broadcaster, writer, media maker and festival director who is responsible for some of Australia's more innovative, unconventional and successful cultural projects and events. Marcus is currently writing a book called Creating Cities, and I'll let him take over.
Okay, good. All right. Thank you very much. I was going to just work off a series of random slides, and then I just piked at the last minute and decided to go with ones that actually are in some sort of sensible order. And also in terms of the restoration thing, we just bought a house somewhere on the other side of Brunswick, and I've been just trying to find floorboards that match the floorboards that were already in the house. I have no idea how you do what you do. Where did you go? That's just hell. Trying to restore vases that are 200 years old, I've got no idea. So I'm going to talk about Renew. I guess I'm the Renew bit of the whole dynamic. The projects that I'm involved in are called Renew Newcastle or Renew Australia. And it's interesting because people don't usually ask me to think about my work in the context of sustainability. And in some ways, I thought I'd start by being a bit provocative and say that the ideal of sustainability is often the enemy of what we do. It's actually really, really, really hard, and I'll hopefully will explain some along the way, for us to do the kind of, we work a lot with the adaptation of the built environment, and for us to meet the standards of sustainability that are being applied to the built environment these days is almost impossible, because what we do is temporary and cheap and quick, and it's about what you can get away with and resourcefully adapt. It's not about building whatever it is 7-star energy standard buildings. It's about getting to buildings that are leaky and have holes in them and making them work for something now. But also I think it's also kind of worth putting that in the context of economic sustainability as well. So, economic sustainability is one of those weird terms that gets abused and misused by pretty much everyone who uses it. But it's interesting, a lot of the thinking behind the work that we've done has come from looking at how my home city, Newcastle, evolved over time. That wasn't sustainable. That's the BHP Steelworks. It's obviously not there anymore, so that's a pretty good sign that the entire industry that the city had been built off has disappeared. 20,000 jobs in a couple of decades went with the steelworks. The inspiration behind the work of Renew was looking at, I've been living in Melbourne for 10 years, but just going back and looking at my hometown and looking at the state that it was in. And these are all photos from 2008. Do people know Newcastle at all? Don't know, some people do. This is the second oldest theatre in Australia. It's been empty all my life, pretty much. There is no way of adapting that building cheaply. It's physically impossible to do anything with that building. And part of the reason is, because the bar, every year the building has sat empty, the bar has got higher and higher about the expectation of what you're expected to do something with it. And so that's a challenge. It's not necessarily a bad thing, because it would be almost certainly a death trap if you turned it into a theatre again tomorrow. But it's a challenge, the way in which those two things are converging or diverging. Lots of empty buildings. That was basically the experience of being in Newcastle in 2008. I mean, it's not, it's one of the most historic, oldest buildings in the city. It's been empty for 15 years, bought by a developer who wanted to turn it into a poker machine palace and failed, and it's been decaying all these years. And then, entire city blocks have been decaying. All of these red dots were empty buildings in Newcastle when the Renew Newcastle project began in 2008. I counted 150 of them. I walked up and down the two main streets and noted them all on a little map, and noted them all in a little notebook and then fancied the map up later. But it's an idea of just how far the city had kind of fallen. Now, my interest, I guess, to the extent that I'm interested in sustainability, it's about scale. It's about localism. It's about thinking about the world in which you live not as a massive system of stuff that comes from the other side of the world, or massive things that require someone else to influence them, but about your own capacity to influence through your actions the places in which you live. So this is what was meant to happen to Newcastle. In 2008, 1988, they were going to do this, and that was going to fix everything. There was this plan in 2004. Look, trees, they look in a nice little line, and looks very good in an artist illustration. For a long time, the biggest industry in Newcastle was artist illustrations of what Newcastle was supposed to be. There were two versions of this very same shot that were done in two plans that were made 5 years apart. And the only thing, like the buildings changed and all this other stuff changed, but the artist who did the illustration was too lazy to change the car. And so there was the same like beat-up car sitting in the foreground. And meanwhile, if you'd seen you saw the photos of the actual street before, like, this is just like this whole mega master planning. This is what the future is going to arrive. It's going to land from on high, and people are going to spend lots of money on it, and they're going to build it for you. And frankly, I'm a bit sceptical about that. Part of the reason why I'm a bit sceptical about that is because none of that stuff has ever happened. It's been like 20 years or something ridiculous that, worth of master plans you see there, but none of the stuff, well, I'm exaggerating slightly. There are bits of some of those plans that have happened. But by and large, the artist illustrations never come to fruition. Meanwhile, what really interests me, and I guess what will interest a lot of you, is the changing dynamics of how we make culture, how we exchange, how we do things with each other. Has anyone seen deadmalls.com? Ruined porn website for shopping centres that have closed around the world. I kind of enjoy it. Perverse enjoyment. The consumption logic. Poor Jerry. His entire world is falling apart, and I feel so sorry for the man. And we should send him something. But it's not entirely that consumption is collapsing. It's that the patterns and dynamics of who is exchanging what with who is changing in lots of interesting kind of ways. Because more and more we're getting things online through iTunes and whatever. To zoom out, I thought I had this great idea, and I'll come back to it in a minute with Renew Newcastle. I had this great idea because I'd suddenly noticed this explosion of makers and creators and artisans and craftspeople all around me. And I'd seen these 150 empty buildings in the two main streets of Newcastle, and I thought I was a genius. Because I'd come up with this idea. I thought, what would happen if you put makers and artisans and craftspeople into all of these empty buildings in Newcastle? Like surely they could make some sort of difference and make some kind of adaptation to how the city works. I'm not a genius because actually that's how the city used to work. I'm just 150 years too late to arrive on that idea. Everything, when you actually start to look at the shops back in 150 years ago, everything was made there. The leather and grindery store, these guys made hats and drapery and milliners and designers. This is nominally a butcher, but that looks a lot more like an abattoir to me than a butcher. It was being made there. Again, milliners, designers, emporium of hat makers and studios, and confectionery works that makes confectionery locally for the local community. This one I love. That's a jeweller, which you can sort of see in that picture. Now, I know where I'm standing here, so this is not going to shock anyone, but for me, growing up, the idea of what a jeweller was like a shop that sold, prefabricated objects that were made somewhere else. That's what it looked like out the back. And that looks a lot more like here than it looks like a shop, So the way in which the city has adapted and changed over time, I think, is really fascinating. And I always like this one. This is the bicycle builder that used to be at one end of Hunter Street. And if you needed a part for your car, they could also get those in. We used to live in a world that looked like this. So sorry, I've got fancy animations. We used to live in a world where people who lived in an area made stuff for people from that area. And then you had this sort of local diversity and resilience and this local ecology and economy that supported each other. And then what happened was we sort of moved to a world where everything got very centralised. So, if you got bicycles, well, I don't know, Malvern Star, were they in Malvern? Does anyone know that? I don't know. They were the only bicycles I could buy as a kid growing up, and I'm pretty sure they weren't making them in Newcastle. And then eventually they started making them in a factory in China somewhere that wasn't, I don't know, Guangzhou Star or something. And so what happened was we started to sort of change our places around the dynamics of buying stuff rather than the dynamics of making stuff, And this is kind of like this is actually before my earliest years, I'm not quite that old, but this is kind of like, my grandmother and my mother's era of Main Street Newcastle, the high street where the national brands are all there and whatever, and people are shopping and walking up and down the main street, and it's the first wave of that era of consumption rather than creation taking over the city. But you fast forward a bit further and then that gets kind of globalised, you know, like everything gets made in a factory in China, everything gets made in a factory somewhere on the other side of the world, and the places which we buy stuff start to look more and more and more like this, or like this. I had a strangulated hernia in that car park when I was 2 and nearly died. That is a complete aside. Now that looks like that. That's a Westfield now. It's been, you know, it's an entire monolithic thing that has just taken over, not just the block, but like an entire part of the city. It's like the shopping centre that swallowed that part of the city. And what's left behind is that this was the building with the Taylor and the Mercer and all of that sort of stuff, and it's boarded up. And the antiques place is boarded up, and that's boarded up, and that's boarded up. Meanwhile, I'm going to introduce you to something that you guys probably don't need to know about, but in a lot of places I talk about, people find this really fascinating. You know how everyone thinks we had a coal mining boom? Growth in participation in various areas over 6 years. This is Australian Bureau of Statistics numbers. Jewellers, 671.6%. You have kicked coal miners' asses if you're jewellers, right? Like, admittedly, you're coming off a lower base. I guess your products probably sell for more by weight than coal, but possibly not in quite the same volume. So, you know, I guess it's not as big an industry, but you're seeing this dramatic change in terms of what is possible in terms of creation and consumption.
Sorry, is that a show how many more people have become jewellers, or...?
Professional and semi-professional. It's Source, ABS work in selected culture and leisure activities. So and their definition of work is doing it for more than just your family and friends. So not... their definition of a hobbyist is someone who does stuff at home and doesn't share it with anyone, and their definition of someone who's doing work is someone who is involved in some sort of exchange. Not necessarily, you know, like running a shop or doing it as their main job, but yeah. Everyone's taking a photo of this. It's kind of funny because I use this a bit and no one ever cares that much. But the upshot of it is that there's lots of dynamics going on. Now, some of this is really interesting because some of it is really sustainable. Like some of it is a real change back to that earlier dynamic of localism. But some of it is kind of something else. It's the globalisation of small-scale stuff. It is the idea that like there are people in Newcastle who are making stuff and selling it to New York, or in Melbourne and selling it to Mumbai, or Sydney and selling it to Shanghai. This is my little Etsy search from a couple of years ago. There were 2,100 items being sold on Etsy in Newcastle. And one of the really weird stats is that 70% of Australian Etsy sales, apparently according to the CEO of Etsy, are international exports. So we've got these crazy dynamics now where the local is global and the tiny is big and the small, you know, the big, Jerry Harvey is complaining that he can't compete, meanwhile people in garages are selling stuff to people on the other side of the world. And I find these dynamics kind of fascinating. The sustainability, because I sort of use these stats very positively, but I'm not sure necessarily the sustainability of this is all that great. I suspect most of these things are kind of air freighted to the other side of the world, and it's, in one aspect of it is quite an indulgence in some ways. We can discuss that later, I guess. But a big part of what I was interested in was the idea of how you bring back that culture and dynamism of making to a local community. So in 2008, we set up a not-for-profit company called Renew Newcastle, and we borrow buildings and we lend them to people who make stuff. That guy was the crowd in the main mall in Newcastle in 2008. I seemed very upset that I was taking this photo too. We basically managed to start to convince the owners of some of these 150 vacant buildings to lend them to us, so we could in turn lend them to other people. And the rule with Renew is you need to make what you do. You can be a software developer, you can be a 3D printer, you can be a jeweller, you can be a photographer, a graphic designer, it doesn't matter, but you need to visual artist, but you need to make what you do. We're trying to bring back that layer of distinctiveness and activity to the city. And what we started to do was lend these buildings to people who had ideas and imagination, so photographers. And this is an upcycled design store. This was a visual arts installation in a building that had never had a fit out. And so we were able to take advantage of that. The artists, well, I wasn't able to take advantage of it, but the artists did an installation where they covered the wall with latex and got the public to come in and rip it off. And I was drunk at the opening and it was lots of fun. I have no idea what the sustainability implications of covering a wall with latex are. Someone can tell me about that later. That's a collective of local makers and artisans and craftspeople who did a fit out on $60 in Hard Rubbish Day in a shop that had been empty for 5 years. That's an old ophthalmologist surgery that became a hub for local little creative enterprises of various kinds. These are chronological, so this is like the city gradually transforming. All the first photos I showed you were 2008. By 2010, you're starting to see people and life, local fashion labels, designers, more photographers. This is a record label that had been operating out of someone's bedroom. This is a little design business. I love this because that's pegs, clothes pegs hanging from a piece of net. If you'd seen the shop, if you'd seen it empty, it was ugly. It did an amazing job. These guys are young boys. The youngest is 17 and the oldest is 21, and they design T-shirts and skateboard decks and streetwear. And they now have a full commercial business selling that stuff from Newcastle all over. Again, you can see life, activity coming back. This is a co-working space in an old, in a newish, newly renovated office space that had been done up recently. Again, this is the same streets I was showing you before. This is one of our favourite projects, Studio Melt. They're jewellers. They run jewellery classes, not dissimilar to what some of you do. Some of you may even know the people involved in that project. Sometimes when I open my mouth, people go, "Oh, my stuff is stocked there." And there's kind of this weird thing. There's this invented this word, peer tailing, like peer-based retailing, where people, rather than buy stuff from a supplier somewhere, are exchanging stuff with each other. So you can walk into a little shop in Newcastle and you can find something handmade in Newcastle. You can also find something handmade in Adelaide, and the person in Newcastle knows the person in Adelaide, and they know why they made it, and they can tell you that story, and they have somehow exchanged stuff with each other. And this shop has been very successful doing that sort of stuff. That's a photographer's space. That's just done with drawers salvaged from the old, from the dump, basically. This is the old David Jones building. It had been the biggest department store in the centre of the city and had been empty. It started to close down just as we opened up, and we had to find a cheap way of adapting it. So we just built some cheap partitions and made the space available to various local makers and artisans and artists and craftspeople. These ladies make kids' clothes, and so now this entire block that had previously been dead in the centre of the city is no longer dead. By 2013, that's where the guy was sitting. You know the guy before? He was sitting about there. The photo was taken from about there. So the street has changed. The whole life and activity of the city has changed. People have come back. Life has come back. Business and enthusiasm and activity has come back, but it's come back in a very bottom-up, grassroots way. And it's come back in a way that has been about tapping into the resourcefulness and the resilience of the people in the local community. Basically what's happened is that there's 60 buildings in Newcastle that have been fixed up by someone rolling up their sleeves, getting in there, cleaning them up, fixing them up, and doing it themselves. Now, interestingly, to go back to that question of what the Sustainable Building Code says that those people should be doing, it's slightly more complicated than that. If you're actually trying to apply the top-end standards to what we try to do, it doesn't quite match up. These buildings are leaky, they're falling apart. We're trying to do what we can in a resourceful and resilient kind of way. But nonetheless, there has been a great transformation for the city. So what I want to kind of just finish on is just some thoughts on the work that we've been doing. I should say that there's been other places and other contexts in which the Renew stuff has been happening since we first started in Newcastle, but I just wanted to kind of finish on some thoughts about what we do and what it means in the context of sustainability. The first thing that I would just overwhelmingly want to emphasise is that sustainability is adaptability. Sustainability can't just be about pristine standards of perfectly finished things that have 100%, the insulation on them is perfect and they're the most sustainable design ever and they're whatever. Sustainability has to be about being able to actually do stuff with the resources that you've got. The ability to evolve adaptation and not simply just leap forward and backwards in great steps is a challenge. To me, I think a lot of it's about taking capital out of the equation, making it not about the big scale stuff and instead making it about people with their own resources being able to do their own things, try their own things. And a lot of that is just about making, failing and doing and trying stuff cheap, allowing lots of people to do lots of things. To me, sustainability is about a pragmatic opportunity and not an ideal. Sustainability is about building. Everything I do is about iterative processes. It's about building up from today, tomorrow, the next day, and the day after that, the best thing you can build. It's not about, I'm a pragmatic idealist, I ultimately, I want to do the best thing I can possibly do with what I've got. I can't change what I've got. And starting with what you've got is important to where you can get to. And I think this relationship, and I just want to tease it out, I really just want to flag it between the local and the global, is complex. But it's opening up all sorts of really interesting possibilities at the moment that I personally find really important. Cities are really about, to me, and the work that I do is about cities, it's about the scale of sweat and not the scale of capital. It's about like people being able to do things with their own energy and not being reliant on people who have access to money, resources, capital, expertise, lawyers, planning consultants, architects, designers, whatever. The higher you set the bar in terms of what you ask of people to be able to do anything at all, the less people who can do something. And there's a challenge, there's a tension that I personally find fascinating and challenging between wanting to set the bar higher because we want great standards, and the reality of that the higher the bar gets, the more the fewer the people who are that can cross that threshold. And I think that's a really interesting challenge. But finally, the biggest lesson I've found along the way is that you learn by doing. Try stuff, fail, try stuff, fail better, fail more, fail good, succeed. It's not that hard. Thanks.